Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com.
Today we have Cort Rudolph on the podcast, and we're going to be talking about generations and generational differences.
Or the lack thereof. This is going to be a great podcast. And, we're going to talk about what generations are, if they even exist. We're going to talk about whether or not they matter. We're going to talk about some myths about generations and generational differences. And, of course, some implications for people, leaders, and organizations. So before I introduce him, just so you know, we actually have him on the podcast. Say hi, Cort.
Hey, how you doing? Thanks for having me.
Awesome. This is our pleasure. So Cort Rudolph is an associate professor of industrial and organizational psychology at St. Louis University. He received a BA from DePaul University and his master's and PhD from Wayne State University. Cort's research focuses on a variety of issues related to the aging workforce, including applications of lifespan development theories, well-being and work longevity, and ageism, generationalism. He is an associate editor of the Journal of Vocational Behavior and serves on the editorial review boards of the Journal of Managerial Psychology and the Journal of Occupational and Organizational Psychology. And today's conversation really came about because he's got a paper that's in press right now at the Journal of Business and Psychology. I came across it and I said, wow, we've got to talk to Cort about this. So he's the lead author of an article that's titled Generations and Generational Differences, Debunking Myths in Organizational Science and Practice and Paving New Paths Forward. So with that being said, that's the focus of today's conversation. So I guess let's just start off with your initial thoughts about, what motivated you to write this article. Tell us a little bit about your research and some of your thoughts around generations.
Yeah, so I started studying generations, probably about 7 years ago, I would say, 7 or 8 years ago, mostly stemming from work that I was doing regarding aging at work and features of the kind of older worker workforce. And there was a couple of things here. I mean, first of all, I would get these reviewer comments on papers regarding age and work. And the comments would say something like, yeah, this is great, but couldn't these differences or couldn't these effects or couldn't these relationships that you're finding with age be due to generational differences? And so, the short answer is maybe. I don't know. Let's go figure that out. And so I started digging into that literature a little bit and, reading a lot of the early work that was done in sociology on this, and then sort of digging through, what empirical work we can find in our field in psychology and OB and management. About generations and generational differences, and kind of figured out really quickly that the answer to reviewer 2 is pretty strongly no. That these age effects are probably not generational, and in fact, anything that we probably think is a generational effect could be better explained either by an age effect or by some interaction between people and the time and place that they're living and current kind of contextual contemporaneous factors. And when you kind of figure out what's going on in this literature, what you figure out pretty quickly is that there's a lot of limitations with the ability to study generations, so much so that I've made this statement before and I'm happy to stand by it. I don't think we've ever actually done a study of generational differences because I'm not even sure it's possible to study these things.
and the reason I'm laughing is because I know the rest of this story. This generational stuff that pervades pop psychology, media, LinkedIn, your dinner room conversations, all of it is crap. It's garbage, guys.
Yeah, that's the technical way to put it.
Yeah, since here on the Indigo podcast, we focus on evidence-based interventions for individuals and organizations. There was no way that we couldn't kidnap Cort for an hour or so and get him on here to talk about it, right? So let's do a deeper dive. So, what is a generational, or what is a generation anyway?
Yeah, so there's a few different ways that we can think about this. And I think the most kind of classical sociological perspective on this is that generations are this sort of unit of like social importance. And so sociologists talk about generations as like these sort of groupings of birth cohorts that have gone through these sort of formative life experiences early on in their youth. And so a classic example from the sociological literature is the experience of the Great Depression. So there's these sort of broad studies of children who grew up during the Great Depression and looking at kind of the effects of that experience, the sort of formative early experience on later life outcomes. And so generations in a sociological sense are this sort of unit of study for understanding social change. And the basic principle from the sociological literature is stemming from this early sort of thought experiment that was put out by a researcher from sociology named Karl Mannheim. And Mannheim says something like, would it be possible for societies to change if there weren't new generations to bring new ideas to bear on culture? And so the idea behind generations really comes from this sort of this perspective of, can we understand culture change from the way in which new members of society bring new ideas to bear on that culture? So somewhere in the mix of all of this, these ideas get co-opted. And so in like translating these ideas into business and management and marketing, there becomes this process of labeling different generations and ascribing qualities to these generations so that we can differentiate them, so that we can segment markets, so that we can say that there are, differences between members of one generation versus another in terms of values or attitudes or behaviors,
Yeah, you say the first word that comes to mind: millennial, avocado toast.
Yeah, avocado toast. Or,
it's not millennial. They're 40 years old and retiring from the military with 20
Yeah.
years of service and over a decade of war.
Yeah,
oh,
exactly.
No, that one doesn't come to mind at all.
Exactly. Yeah. So they become these really convenient wrappers that we can put around this really complicated thing, which is everybody gets older and everybody experiences age-related change. And everybody has this fundamental motivation to understand other people's behavior. And when we have these sort of universals, we need to simplify some of the complexity there. And so generations are really a convenient way of doing that. We get these sort of labels and prototypes of what a member of one generation versus another generation looks like or does or thinks or values, and then we can draw lines between them, which helps simplify otherwise really complicated things like this really messy process of development, which is different for everyone, or the changing nature of society, which is experienced different by everyone as well. And so if we kind of intersect those two things, aging and culture change, then we get this idea of generations, and it becomes sort of this universal thing that people kind of accept as being truth. Generations exist, so we might as well talk about them, right?
Right. So it's kind of a cognitive shortcut that we use to try to think about the world and our place in it and who we are even. And, this has really been a pervasive thing. We were talking when we were prepping for this episode. Cort and I both went to graduate school around the same time period. And, I was thinking back to, early on in that experience, 2007, 2008, there was really starting to be this burgeoning, at least in the popular side of things, in the popular press, about managing millennials and things like that. It always struck me as odd. It was like there's this different species or something, and but it's been pervasive. There are lots of people who have built entire consulting practices and sold books around this whole idea, and it's just fascinating to me that this is persistent.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I use this analogy always that you can like walk through an airport bookstore and look at the shelves, and some 3 or 4 of these books at least are going to be about features of managing generations in some capacity. And that's like to me the sort of prototype of what is popular business press. It's like you're walking through the airport, you're getting a bottle of water and you're getting a book about managing millennials. I feel like, that's where this sort of stuff comes out. So yeah, no. And the funny thing too about this like emergence of this idea that, oh, we need to manage millennials, is that you can trace that back. And so there's books from the 80s about managing members of Generation X. And you can find references going back to the 50s about managing members of this sort of like emerging boomer generation as well. Not nearly as formalized and not nearly as much of an industry around it as well. But yeah, you can go online and you can hire yourself a generations consultant to come into your organization and tell you how to do this, that, and the other thing to manage members of different generations, and also to manage the differences between them, which I guess is sort of the other issue too.
Yeah, Ben,
Yeah.
that's our moneymaker. Managing numbskulls, a complete guide. We'll make $1 million. But I used to think when this stuff first came out, and they're like, well, and this is this pervasive idea of, if I can learn, this is like the worst clickbait on the internet. Cure your foot fungus with Windex and this one easy trick, right? I mean, this is like the managerial version of that, which is garbage, because underlying it, in my view, is this idea that if I can just say the magic words, I can get people to be a cog in the wheel. I can get them to be automatons in my organization. And that's bull. That is just such baloney. It's ridiculous. So wait a minute. Your company can't retain its talent? It must be them. If I knew the magic words. So yeah, where's that introspection of my company's garbage? Or, hey, man, these guys maybe grabbed capitalism a little bit more fiercely, developed a skill set that they're able to print cash with elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And like some of this stuff that we've seen, it's like, hey, listen, we don't want to be able to keep them forever. We actually don't have that big of an organization. But if we could just retain them for 2 years, because we need somebody to do this numbskull work. And there's all this other stuff that goes into it. But the shortcut is blaming a generation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just stinking thinking. It's shortcutted and it's bad.
Yeah, and I'll just quote Cort's writing back to him here, because I love this piece from the beginning part of his article, in which he says, and I quote, "Indeed, a recent consensus study published by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine concluded that," and this is quoting again from that, "categorizing workers with generational labels like baby boomer or millennial to define their needs and behaviors is not supported by research and cannot adequately inform workforce management decisions," end quote. I think that's a really key thing for us to be thinking about here, in terms of why are we treating people differently based upon some generational, I'm using the little quote thing here, right? Differences. It's just it's a pervasive myth that really needs to be exterminated, in my view.
Absolutely.
Now, I think there's some cohort approaches, like people that graduated during the last economic downturn. Like they've shown like lifetime earnings can be based on when you happened in history. Like if you were born during the Black Plague, you had an X% chance of dying. Okay, that's fine. That's a cohort and place and time effect.
Mm-hmm.
But let's talk about some lenses by which we can view generations, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So like one of them is the social construction. What is that?
Yeah, so this idea of the social construction perspective, the social constructionist perspective on generations, really stems from this idea that we need a way to rectify the fact that, as you just said, the evidence base for this is really not existent. But everyone loves this idea, right? So how do we rationalize the fact that generations exist in people's minds, but that they don't actually manifest and affect work behavior or values or whatever? And so the social constructionist perspective tries to put some sort of a framework around understanding what the value of generations is to people. And so the first thing that it recognizes is that we made these things up. And so by recognizing that we made these things up because we needed to simplify a really complicated issue. And so the first tenet here is basically generations are social constructions. We made them up through various mechanisms. This is supported by media. This is supported by, sort of basic fundamental psychological processes related to stereotyping and prejudice, prejudice and discrimination. so if we acknowledge that generations don't really exist, then we start to ask different questions about them. And the questions we need to ask from a constructionist lens are, why do people like these things? Why do they apply them? And what is the consequence of applying them? And so we can start to ask questions about what supports this continued focus on generations. How do people learn about generations? So, what are the sources of information that lead people to form these sort of broader pictures of what members of one generation versus another look like? So that's one perspective. So social constructionist perspective basically is hey, given that we know that generations don't hold that much water as a kind of a unit of study, what do we do with this pervasiveness of generations, and how do we make sense of it? And so the other kind of piece of this is that recognizing the social constructivist kind of perspective on generations gets us to a place where we can start to ask questions about why people use generations as kind of a sense making tool, and why people turn to generations as a way of making sense of really complicated features of social environments. So I mean, there's all different related variables sort of in kind of intertwined within this perspective. One common one to look at is sort of generational identity, and like sort of the strength with which people kind of identify with one generation versus another. So this isn't saying that a generation objectively exists, but basically you can ask people, hey, do you believe that you're a member of this generation? And what are the implications of that belief system?
Yeah.
So I've got my friend who says I'm an elder millennial.
Yeah.
So she wants to be hip to the technology, but not dumb as those numbskulls.
Well, the reason we started pushing for this is kind of interesting. So you asked the question before about like why did I start doing this work? And it comes from teaching, actually. So I teach undergraduate personnel psychology. And I have students give presentations about different features of personnel systems, and one in particular that students usually talk about is different recruitment methods that organizations can use to attract new members. And more than once, I had students that would get up and give a presentation, and they would say something like, as a member of this generation, I want this, 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 and this from an employer. And the first time I heard it, it didn't, I was like, what are you talking about? And then the second time I heard it, I was like, that's the same thing I heard before. And the third time I was like, well, there's a pattern here. And so the question is, where do people get these ideas from? And so I just started asking people, like, why do you think that as a millennial, you're seeking flexibility? And the answer invariably was, well, I've been told that millennials want flexibility. And it's like, wait a second. So you're constructing this own picture of your own identity as this member of a generation. And that's changing the way that you're seeking out information about organizations that you want to join. And then it just becomes this sort of weird cycle of reinforcing these ideas from, this is what the organization thinks people want. This is the message that we're using to recruit people. Holy crap, I'm a millennial. I might as well join that organization that favors flexibility. Oh, but by the way, nearly everybody wants flexibility, right? And so it doesn't, and everybody wants these sort of core features of jobs, autonomy and flexibility and feedback for performance, and to feel like their work is meaningful. And it has nothing to do with generations at all. It's just that like some HR recruiter figured out something once about job design and then translated that into a generational difference. And everybody thinks that millennials want all this stuff, or members of another generation don't, or whatever. And then they tailor their practices to that. And there's no basis in actual reality.
Well, wait a minute. I just Googled what millennials want from work. And the first thing that shows up in the result, what millennials want from work, 7 research-backed truths.
Research-backed,
yeah. Maybe they're sitting on a pile of old journals while they just, puke out this stuff. But a culture fit. Aligned personal and organizational values, timely and regular recognition, ability to learn and rise through the ranks. Who doesn't want that? I woke up today, I turned 50, guys, and all of a sudden I don't care about recognition at work or the ability to get promoted.
Well, yeah, that's no, I mean, that's the other really fascinating thing about this is that people see this as like a staged process, right? Or like, I mean, that's sort of implying that there's like these jumps in age differences, right? But also people make these like really, they kind of put up these walls between generations, and they don't recognize that, like, in psychology, we talk a lot about variability between and within groups, right? We're really interested in like the distribution of individual differences. Like, I have no doubt that there is somebody there who doesn't want that much autonomy in their job. Like, there are some days, honestly, where I wish someone would just tell me what to work on because I'm sitting there, whatever. But that's an individual difference that's going to vary across generations. And there's going to be more variability in preferences for work features, within and between generations that aren't accounted for when we just say millennials want this, boomers want, it doesn't make sense. Pretty quickly falls apart.
Yeah. So another lens that you've mentioned in your paper and that we've talked about when we were prepping for this episode, through which we can view this idea of generations, is the lifespan development type of view.
Yeah.
What's that about?
Yeah. So the lifespan development view comes from kind of core theories in developmental psychology. And so one of the things that I do in my work is to try to bring these theories over from developmental psychology so that we can come to a better understanding of the role of age and aging in the workplace. And so the lifespan development view takes a pretty different take on the role of age in the workplace than the generations view would have us believe. So the lifespan view is based on this idea that development occurs as a lifelong process. And so we get rid of all these ideas of kind of stages of development. And we instead talk about intra-individual variability and kind of factors that predict changes and trajectories of development over time. So core to this idea is this idea that we really need to consider individual differences in development rather than thinking about groups of people as cohorts. And so the generations model tends to focus on grouping people into these broad cohort groups, and then we label them and then we treat them differently, right? And so the generations model doesn't really fit with what developmental psychology would say about the role of age and age-related change over time. We recognize in this model that there's a lot of variability that needs to be accounted for within the developmental course, but we also look at things like factors that modify development. And so, for example, there's a recognition that contemporaneous events, like you were suggesting before, growing up or coming of age during a recession and entering the job market during a recession, that might have a profound impact on individuals. It likely does, right? But that's not going to manifest as a generational difference. That's more of this sort of idiosyncratic developmental sort of shock that would change the course of development for some, but perhaps not everybody.
Yeah, if your mommy bought your way into Harvard and you're now rotting in jail, you may be on a different, cooler trajectory than people that had to earn their own way.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And that's really the problem with generations, is that it's really top down, right? It's like something happened, it affected everybody in every member of this cohort, and then it's this sort of heterogeneous process that's sort of followed them through life. It's like this shadow of being a member of a specific cohort. And so this has been called various things. It's been called cohort determinism. It's been called the generations trap. So falling into this idea that, like, just because everybody went through the last recession doesn't mean that everybody came out of that worse or better or whatever. People find their own way through those types of contemporaneous, exogenous shocks, so to say. And so the generations perspective gets us to a place where we can talk about aging and work, and we can talk about actionable things we can do to manage an aging workforce that doesn't require us to label people on the basis of generations, assume these sort of homogenous processes that flow from thinking about generations. It gets us to a place where we can talk about age directly and not indirectly by categorizing people into younger versus older generations groups. It opens up the doors to a whole bunch of other research questions. But again, it has a lot of practical value in that we can actually translate the suggestions from lifespan perspectives into, hey, what should we do to manage an older and aging workforce, or what should we do to manage workers across the entirety of the work lifespan, rather than thinking about, we got to focus on just the millennials because of, whatever assumptions we're going to make about what they want, or
because somebody in HR bought one of those horrible books at the airport.
Yeah,
that's why we're going to focus on generation.
It just strikes me as so odd, and it always has, the labeling that happens with regard to generations, because we recognize that that's not a great way to think about other groups in society, right? Even let's even say, okay, generations exist. Let's put that out there, even though that's dubious at best. Right. Even if they do exist, putting broad labels on such a gigantic group of people is doesn't work very well, right?
Let's use the D word, discrimination.
I mean, it doesn't work so well with when we refer to different races and ethnic groups. It doesn't work really great when we talk about different genders. So let's maybe not do that with generations, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, the funny thing is, right, so aging is a universal experience for most people who are lucky, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully, we're all going to get old.
It took me a minute. I'm slow, but I'm worth waiting on. Say that again.
So, I mean, hopefully, we're all going to get old, right? Everybody. Yeah. Some aren't. But truthfully, that's one of the few universal experiences, is the process of aging. And so we don't, not everybody is a member of one race versus another, or not everybody identifies with a specific gender versus another. And so we can make differences between those relatively easily. And it's a pretty socially unacceptable thing to do, right? But age, open season. Let's go for it. I mean, and then we can say, well, that's ageist. We can say, like, well, classifying older people as whatever litany of stereotypes you want to, that's ageist. But let's do something a little bit different. Let's couch this in terms of generations. Now we're removing the age component. We're talking about generations, which doesn't classify individuals. It's classifying groups that are socially agreed upon. And so then we can say, well, millennials do this and boomers do this. And really what we're saying is that older people do this and younger people do this. And so it's really thinly veiled ageism. I mean, it's almost like this sort of modern form of ageism where we can justify being ageist on the basis of saying, no, I'm not ageist. This has to do with generations.
Some old people are hip to Instagram and can check their email.
Yeah, sure.
Right? Some old people don't forward you, Dad, if you're listening to this, don't forward you every piece of garbage that they get into their inbox, right? But you see how easy it is to just immediately, this is basically socially sanctioned discrimination. And it's not just in these pop books. It's it's in HBR, Harvard Business Review, which a lot of people look at. It's like, well, I mean, hey, this is a big institution. They got a lot of, one of the elite business schools. They've got they can have any professor they want for the most part. HBR's had some articles that have missed it, right?
Yeah. So HBR has had a few articles about this, and you see these pop up. And then they also, but to be fair, I mean, they've also had a few articles where they go, well, wait a second, guys, hold on. But then that's super confusing too, because you got two papers in front of you, and one says something exists and one says something doesn't exist. And which one are you going to go with? Are you going to go with the one that society says exists? Or are you going to go with this sort of, wait a second, hold on a second, let's think about this
whatever
idea a little bit more critically.
My view at the time.
Whatever justifies,
that's what I go with.
Whatever justifies the money I've already spent on a consultant to tell me that they exist or whatever, right? We already have a budget for this program, so oops, it must be important, right? Yeah.
But this is so important because we're talking from the top fount of where working practitioners and business people go to get their information, and that there's baloney being put out. And we're dealing writ large as a society with all kinds of, well, how do we define bias? How do we maybe uproot it and change it for the better? Hey, discrimination is bogey. Like maybe you don't mind discriminating against older people until you need a job in your 70s, right? Sure. All these things. Like I think like at a 30,000 foot level, we can say, hey, this is garbage. But then we get down to the level where it's got to execute. All of a sudden, all this stuff flies apart and we are executing the same garbage. So, Harvard knows about bias and all this stuff, yet here it's so insidious. It's like eggs in a cake, right? If somebody has an egg allergy, you can say, hey man, I'm eating this cake. I can't taste the eggs in there.
Yeah.
But there's eggs baked all in it, and it's just ubiquitous. You can't. We've baked a cake of bias and discrimination that it's going to take smart people like Cort to help us. Help, Cort, get us out of here, man.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's the truth. I mean, it's very deeply ingrained. It's funny. I'm in a psychology department, but there's actually. So here's how deeply ingrained it is. So. Across the street, literally from my building, is our business school. And you can take a class there on generational differences at work. So they're teaching this across the street.
Cort, do you have tenure? You're not going to get fired from this episode,
no,
are you?
I'm tenured. It's cool.
Okay, thank God. All right. No, I bring away business school.
I bring this up every chance that I get. And so, but yeah, you can, if you do a little Googling for this, we're not the only offenders. It's just the day that I Googled that, because I was trying to make the point, hey, is this actually taught in business curricula? Is that, and I Googled it and I was like, wait a second, what's this first hit? And I was like, oh, you guys. Oh, you guys, these are my people here. What are you doing? So yeah, it's interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
It's
yikes.
We're building education policy around this. There's a lot of discussion right now in higher ed about, do we need to, modify how we recruit undergrad students on the basis of generational things? Do we need to attend to differences in their their preferences for education? And probably not. I would think not, based on the broader literature on this. But there's a lot of money being dumped into that right now for sure.
Yeah, marketing, the entire marketing, all the analytics you get from Google Analytics. If you develop social media, okay, we're looking at age, we're looking at sex. We're any data point is somehow meaningful, so I can sell you my solution. And actually, here's the problem, is people are looking for shortcutted thinking. And the shortcutting thinking is getting us the bias and discrimination that we're seeing in racial issues that are coming to the fore right now. It's all across the board. And we wonder, well, how could somebody be deceived by some of these, say, racist thoughts? Well, here's an example of our own bias that is just baked into our society structurally, i.e. entire lines of business study and work, like marketing, are built around it. And we're stuck here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the marketing stuff is really fast. Honestly, at some level, I think someone made the decision at one point that it's just really hard to explain what a standard deviation is to someone else. And so if we just bucket people, we don't have to explain that variability. It's this, 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 and this. It's not, this range. And so, people like that. People like that simplification. And it on the surface, it's really benign. If you dig into it a little bit, there is a lot of possibilities for this to kind of go south on folks. So you gave this example of millennials are retiring. Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at the cutoffs for these generational groups, and that's a whole messy thing in and of itself, the youngest members of the millennial cohort, so to say, typically or I guess I should say the oldest members, excuse me. They were born in 1980, depending on who you read, right? And so it's 2020, so these folks are turning 40. So all these millennials who are disrupting work are actually, they're technically considered to be older workers as defined by the Age Discrimination and Employment Act. And so millennials are now older workers officially. At some point this year, they started to become older workers. And so everybody who's turning 40 this year, who was born in 1980, who's technically a millennial, if you believe, what Pew says, or one of these organizations that sanctions these labels.
Yeah. Well, I think that actually brings us to a great part of your paper where you talk about these different myths, and you have 10 of them in the paper. And I thought maybe we probably can't go through all 10, but I think we could just pick a couple and talk a little bit about them. The one that you just alluded to, so it's perfect segue here, is what you label as myth number 3, which is that generational labels and associated age ranges are agreed upon, that is a myth. So there's seems to be a wide discrepancy in how we even define these generations.
Yeah, absolutely. So one way to think about this is to consider how individual research papers define different generations. And so if you take papers by 5 research teams that are all purporting to study generational differences, there's a pretty good chance that each one of those papers is going to use slightly different age ranges to define labeled generations, millennials or boomers or whatever. And that's a big problem, right? That's a pretty big liability in science if the way that I measure something is different than the way that you measure something, and we're going to draw similar conclusions on the basis of those differing measurements. Then you might say, well, wait a second here. What are we actually holding constant as part of that? We need to scale something. That's sort of a fundamental premise of psychological measurement. Well, if you're not holding that generational grouping constant, you're working with a moving target. So there's very little consistency among these. And I love to watch people talk about that because they're like, well, one organization says that these are the cutoffs, and then another organization says that these are the cutoffs. And, sometimes they're based on, sometimes they're just like 10-year groupings. Sometimes, so there's a ton of variability in that. But they're definitely not agreed upon. At one level, who cares? It's a heuristic. It tells us something about people, about differences between, sort of these fuzzy groupings of people on the basis of age. At another level, like, we don't really know much about generations if we can't actually define what they are in terms of when they begin and end.
Yeah.
So which leads us to the thing of generations don't exist except in our minds. This is like a horoscope, guys, for businesses.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't believe in that baloney horoscope stuff, Cancer, Leo, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe in these generational differences that forecast who you're going to be as a worker through your life cycle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe there are generational differences in MBTI scores.
Yeah. So I've actually seen papers on this, and I can't. Yeah, so I've seen papers where people do this, right? So they'll take generations, and it gets studied in a variety of contexts. But I think I actually have seen the generations MBTI paper.
Oh my gosh!
And yeah,
gosh, that's horrible. We made up the worst thing we could think of, and lo and behold, Cort,
sure,
it's like it's true, guys.
No. Well, yeah. No, I've said this before, but I mean, like in psychological research, you get some leeway with how you're creative and in the way that you set up your theories and your models, right? But like honestly, you can only really make up one thing, and so you generations are made up, and whatever. I mean, I love talking about the MBTI. That's a whole thing. That's super made up, right? Like, and so you can't make up both the predictor and the criterion in that model. I'm sorry. I know what. Yeah. So it's interesting.
People defend it as, well, you can learn about yourself. And I'm like, well, you can go to a peyote Indian sweat lodge too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is interesting, right? So there's like, these are management fads. And that's the other way we've talked about generational differences, is that there's like, management has this strong culture of ascribing to fads. And, like it used to be MBTI and DISC and, kind of these sort of typology types assessments of personality, and those still exist. They're around too. For a while we were real into like, leaders' emotional intelligence and like what that means and such, right? And and then so generations are sort of like a subtext for this. But there's all all of these sort of pseudo scientific fatty elements of management, like they intersect at some level. So it's actually pretty interesting. I've done a little bit of work kind of digging into the sort of like leadership development generation side of things. And there's just some really fascinating suggestions about, how we should develop members of different generations using like interventions that are based on having leaders ride horses. And so they call this like equine based leadership development. And there's something about the interaction between, members of different generations and sort of like whatever whatever the experience of riding a horse does to you psychologically. And I'm not even joking. I mean, this is serious. This is like published research. So yeah, like I said, I feel like you get to make up one side of the equation when you're doing psychological research, but
not both.
Not both. You can't rely on.
That's right. Well, I think you kind of brought us to what you label in your paper as myth number 6, which is that generations need to be managed at work, that this is a myth, that leaders probably don't need to care about or be concerning themselves with managing people in terms of different generations, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's kind of two levels to this, at least two levels to this. So on the one hand, the research suggests that there's no generational differences to manage. So you're managing some sort of phantom phenomenon, or worse, you're creating the phenomenon, right? So I'm going to treat you differently because I assume you're a millennial. So millennials are panned, right? They're narcissistic and they're entitled, and I think you're entitled. I'm I just got out of business school and I'm a new leader. Oh, that's probably not true, but whatever. I've been told that millennials are going to act narcissistically. Have narcissistic patterns of behavior and that they're going to act very entitled, right? So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to treat you that way, and then I'm going to be surprised when you act that way, right? So if you treat people like they should be narcissistic and that they should be entitled, you shouldn't be surprised if you seek out those differences, you're going to find them. So it's kind of one of these like social psychological, principles of, of the way in which you interact with people affects their behavior. Sort of this like Pygmalion effect kind of a thing, right?
Exactly.
But yeah, no, there's no differences to manage. And so the implication is like, at one level, maybe it's pretty benign. Like, well, you're managing stuff that doesn't exist, so maybe you're just kind of wasting time. But at another level, if you start to treat people differently based on false assumptions that you make about them, that leads you to kind of a bad spot, And so we are starting to see ADEA, Age Discrimination and Employment Act cases brought that have mention of these ideas. So, people are saying, like, I was told that we are an organization that wants to hire millennials, but I'm a member of a different, older generation. And so I was passed up for a promotion or something like this. And so these legal cases are being brought on the basis of Age Discrimination and Employment Act. But the way that age discrimination is being communicated to the people bringing these cases is through a generation's lens. So you're not saying I'm not hiring you because you're older. You're saying, well, we're trying to recruit millennials, and so that sort of subtle subtext. So yeah, there's no generations to really manage here.
Right.
It's an unnecessary liability in some respects.
Sure. Well, and another myth that you mentioned is that members of younger generations are disrupting work, that they're the ones out there that are, kind of shaking things up or whatever, but that seems to not be the case necessarily.
Yeah, so this has a couple of this. So all these myths have some basis in some reality, right? Mm-hmm. And so this kind of goes back to an idea that I discussed earlier, which was that the kind of early conceptualization of generations from a sociological perspective is you need new people to change culture. And so culture theory recognizes this as well. So organizational culture theory recognizes this as well. Like, Schein talks about, changing cultures. To change cultures, you need to have new ideas, and new ideas come with people. All right. And so this idea that members of younger cohorts are changing work probably isn't wrong, but there's all of these sort of, speculations that there's something unique about the way that this young generation is changing work. And the funny thing is that you can trace that back in history. I mean, like, if you go back and read accounts of what youth does to institutions, there's mentions of young new ideas, young people with new ideas changing social institutions over time. And so there's a remarkable kind of cyclical nature to this. Wait a second, things are changing. Who do we blame? We blame the new people.
Yeah, but listen to that. So you're in an organization, and like you look at the Fortune 500. Mm-hmm. They're not the same cohort year after year. Some of them die and go. And this is like the idea of the good idea fairy at scale. This is a whole generation of good idea fairies that are going to change how things are going on here. And it's like, wait a minute. What organization doesn't want good ideas?
Yeah.
You will die on the Capitol capitalist vine if you're not evolving.
Yeah.
And you're not going to get those new ideas continually from the same numbskulls you have right now. You have to refresh.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, who wants to go back to having, buggies and buggy whips?
Right.
Who wants to go back to the Model T Ford? I don't know how my parents raised kids without an iPad, because if we're at a nice dinner,
Sure.
it's just like, here, watch this so I can have 10 minutes of eating with your mom, right?
Mhm.
And like, new ideas are awesome. Yet there's this thing where like, change. Like, we also know that from the literature that
Sure.
change is challenging on us.
Mhm.
We can't continually stay in a growth cycle and maintain our humanity. So the goal for organizations is to maintain this tug of war is actually a positive thing, not
sure.
a negative thing.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And like this disruption idea is everywhere with generations. It's not just within organizations. I mean, you can go on Google and type in "millennials are killing," ... right? And you can get this list that like every hit is like some way of life or product classification or industry that they're killing, like baseball or processed cheese or high heels or and so it's like this is this disruption myth, which is that
I just Googled it. So I got a couple hits for you. Just
Sure.
have to throw this out here. By the way, this was not one you mentioned, but millennials are killing mayonnaise.
Yeah, mayonnaise.
Millennials are killing the diamond industry. Millennials are killing change. The doorbell industry.
no more doorbells. Just text.
A bunch of...
That's
that's great.
so
I just had
funny.
to interject that.
Yeah.
So, and I think this kind of brings us to the last myth that you talk about in the paper. And I encourage all of our listeners to go check out the paper. We'll post a link to it in the show notes. But this last myth is that talking about generations is largely benign.
Mhm.
And I think it'd be great for us to talk a little bit about why there's some non-benign features of referring to generations
Sure.
and using this kind of lens through seeing people in the workforce.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we sort of discussed before, I mean, these ideas at some level seem really benign. They do. They seem like, well, all we're doing is we're talking about generations, guys. It's not a big deal. But as I also suggested, and we talked a little bit about it, this is like a really thinly veiled way of couching ageism or like conveying or communicating about ageism that's really socially sanctioned. And so one of the things that we've tried to do in thinking about how do we talk about the risks of generational thinking is to try to advance the idea of what we call generationalism, which is an ism like racism or sexism. It's basically like, guys, if we take this idea and we try to apply generational labels to everybody, we're going to start to treat people differently as a result of that. And so if we think about generational thinking as an ism, then maybe that'll change the way that people see this sort of otherwise socially accepted way of talking about age or thinking about age, making it a little less socially acceptable to do so. But yeah, no, I mean, it's one of these things where I think that, if you were ranting about, if you wrote a BuzzFeed article about how older people were killing something, or how there were these massive differences between older and younger people that weren't really well founded, maybe that would spark some attention from folks saying, hey, that's a little bit of an ageist sentiment. But if you say it's boomers versus millennials, that kind of protects people from that criticism, I think, a little bit.
Right. Right.
And really, it's stuff I don't like is negative. The things I do like is positive. And so let's just address, Cort, a few bullet points. Why should we care about ageism other than it feels nice and fluffy? What are some concrete reasons we should give a rip?
Well, where do you want me to start?
The list is so long. Sweet.
Well, if you're trying to make a business case, it's illegal to discriminate against workers who are aged 40 and up. Now, younger workers aren't protected by that. Right. So if you're less than the age of 40, you can't really claim age discrimination. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't occur. It just means that that's not a protected class. On the other side of this, if you want to maintain an age-diverse workforce, it kind of behooves you to have a climate that is age-inclusive. My own research on kind of age-inclusive climates and age-inclusive HR practices suggests that if you can develop work systems that are age-inclusive, that actually benefits employee well-being regardless of age. And so organizations that have more age-inclusive human resources practices, which is to say that they're human resources practices that are beneficial to members of the workforce of all ages, that don't single out younger versus older employees, that tends to lead to higher levels of perceived age inclusivity, right? So everybody gets these benefits, everybody gets these, these affordances regardless of their age. I feel like this is a pretty good place to work. Maybe I want to stay there long term, but also those are the types of things that produce, positive health benefits and well-being benefits for workers across the work lifespan. And so there's a sort of legal pragmatic case like, yeah, we shouldn't discriminate against people who are over 40 because, we're going to get sued. But also, hey, if we have a better, more age-inclusive work environment, everyone's going to benefit as a result. That has, long-term, and there's other research that suggests that there's performance, kind of performance benefits from doing the same thing, regardless of work or age. I think, we can think about, other things as well. Like socially, we should strive to have a more inclusive work environment in general. And I think age is sort of a missing component of that. But the other thing we don't really talk about all that much is sort of the intersections among different categories of demographics. Older females, older Black females, sort of those sort of combinations of qualities of people lead to different types of work experiences, different risks for marginalization and such. So again, being kind of one of these universal experiences, everybody gets older, everybody ages, right? But how is that experience different for, members of the workforce who have, different qualities, men versus women, members of different minorities or
yeah. So I think you've already started taking us into some implications here, and I think you just mentioned some great ones for organizations, that there is this liability that you can have in terms of age discrimination. You obviously don't want to create some policies or practices that are based upon generations, right? Because we don't even know if they really exist, and we have concluded based upon the research that doesn't really matter.
No.
And I love your idea of these age climates, right? Having an inclusive climate for people across the spectrum of different ages, that's a good thing. So if we drop down to the individual level, what do you think are maybe some implications for your research and some of these ideas around generations and the lack thereof kind of have for individuals?
Yeah, so individuals can be thought of, and I guess in a couple different ways. I mean, in terms of, let's think about like decision makers. We can talk about different stakeholders within organizations and kind of what these ideas have. But I guess, the one level to think about is sort of individual kind of decision makers within organizations. Maybe people who are setting policies, maybe people who are thinking in terms of, how would we tailor an environment to be, age inclusive? And there's a few different things we can talk about. I mean, like at one level, if we're going to talk about tailoring organizational processes to be age sensitive, we need to recognize that at some level there are some age-related differences in like physical and cognitive abilities, right? But we can tailor work processes to account for that. And so, as workers get older, their physical capacities on average tend to decline somewhat. Well, let's design work that actually can account for that. And so I think for individuals, what I would recommend is we got to stop talking about generations here. We need to start talking about what are we going to do? Because here's the reality. The workforce is getting older. Even in kind of emerging economies, the workforce is getting older across the globe. That's a universal fact. And pension systems are declining, right? And so everyone is going to need to work longer, regardless of where you live. It's pretty clear that there is an economic imperative to extend working lives beyond the traditional 65, average retirement age.
Right.
If we're going to make this thing work long term. And so we need to develop systems that let that happen. And so the way to do that is multiply determined, right? But I mean, like at one level, we need to reduce this sort of age discrimination component, which can drive people out of the workplace. We need to build systems that allow for us to take advantage of all of the opportunities that come with having an older workforce. Knowledge, retaining that knowledge long term. If someone's been with the company for 30 years, they've seen every different way that you've tried to solve that problem. But if they retire because they're feeling pushed out because they've been told that they're a boomer and we're trying to recruit millennials, that talent leaves, that knowledge leaves the organization. What are we going to do with that? So that kind of stuff. I mean, that's the advice I would give. Stop thinking in terms of stop thinking in terms of generations, and start thinking in terms of how do we leverage what we know about all the benefits of an aging workforce, and tailor specifically to changes that we know from lifespan development, changes in sort of like the fluid cognitive capacities and changes in physical capacities. How do we tailor work to that? To be able to take advantage of the fact that, older workers want to work longer and they need to, and we all need to. And so that's an inevitability for everyone coming down the pike for sure.
Yeah.
Right.
So
right.
For the new ideas about the 1%, the newer ideas, right? Let's go there's a resource conflict, right, between the younger generation and the older generation. This idea of, well, we're in this hot mess in our country right now because of what you guys laid down, you jackwagons. Yet, if we know anything, you guys would have, knowing what they knew, you're the same. There wasn't enough evolutionary time span for you to have different cognitive functionings between the boomers to the millennials to the Generation Z, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like the land of the dark elves. Did you want it to be like kill or be killed? It's like, okay, you're old, now go starve to death. You just couldn't hack it. Yeah. Or individuals. I mean, venture, during the early days of Zuckerberg, all these venture capitalists. Well, we need a young entrepreneur that wears a hoodie. Have you seen any of those around? Because young entrepreneurs with hoodies do amazing things. And arguably, there's all these business models that could come out of Silicon Valley and other places from older, more in-depth industry knowledge. But we miss that because of our bias at the individual level, right?
Sure. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's definitely a challenge. Like I said, it's sort of a natural process, and we love classification. People love reducing complicated information into buckets. It's pretty natural, and so overcoming that is a challenge for sure. It doesn't help that it's so supported, that there's so much media attention around generational differences, and that there's so much, it doesn't help that we're teaching MBAs that these things exist and that they're going out there and doing stuff with it. You know what I mean? Like that's.
Yeah, we have all these organizations screaming about discrimination on a whole thing. And they've got it, they're getting way better when it comes to race and stuff, but it's not a speck. There's a plank in their own eye on discrimination it doesn't even take hardly anything for us to pull back the veil here to start to see this stuff.
Right. Well, and one thing you mentioned earlier, Cort, that I thought was really good was, a lot of these things that we talk about or that people say, oh, millennials want flexibility or autonomy, all these types of things that we know, right, that pretty much everybody wants. And I think a good point here, maybe an implication for leaders out there is that, hey, focus on those things that we know work for a lot of people most of their lives. And, people do like to have some variety and autonomy and significance in their work and so forth. So those things, no person out there is going to respond negatively to a leader who values their contributions and cares about their well-being. Right?
Exactly.
It's just it's good stuff, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of basics out there.
Yeah. What I heard on the web was, I'm so glad COVID's here. Maybe some of these old people will just die off. And I remember just looking at that and being like, what in the world? This is not, this is Sparta, and we're going to kick our old people down a hole?
Yeah.
What is wrong here?
Yeah. Sometime in mid-March, I started going through the headlines daily on this stuff and kind of focusing on how is COVID being framed at work in terms of age and work.
Oh,
And so we actually did a little bit of a kind of a, it's rather cursory, but we have a paper where we kind of went through all these headlines and basically what are the themes here? And it's exactly that. I mean, we're seeing a lot of this, like, how is this generational? And then there's like, it's silly stuff like, well, you know what? These millennials have wanted flexibility the whole time and now they get to work from home. So that's going to benefit them. And it's like, well, no, it's going to benefit everybody. This has nothing to do with the preference that people brought, and that preference doesn't even exist. But there's been a ton of speculation about the generational consequences of COVID for work. And it's a pandemic. By definition, it affects everyone.
That's
Yeah,
right.
but
That's
the
right.
actuarials say that if you're over a certain age, you are a much larger chance of dying.
Yeah.
And that's just like macular degeneration. Like as you get older, your eyes, for a lot of people, will start to go bad.
Yeah, so millennials are killing the knee replacement industry too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good grief.
All right, so we're talking about leaders here. And one of the things, all this stuff, we've said it, it's short-cutted thinking.
Yeah.
And so if you're at the top of the organization looking down, you don't want leaders with short-cutted thinking, right? Yeah, it's like we said before, it's stinking thinking. So if they're just applying some easy paint-by-the-numbers management and leadership style, that's not the kind of leader you want in your organization. If you got that kind of leader in your organization, which most of you do, right, you're going to have to do some teaching and training on this. You can't just take the how to manage millennials in 3 easy steps. This is about a sensing function of saying, who is this person? They're not just a cohort. My team is a cohort of tools that I use to go from director to VP. No, that's the wrong answer. That's going to be bad for your organization and how, things like perceived organizational support, because your team can smell that a mile away. So if you're at the top, you need to make sure your leader's below. If you are a leader and don't want to get fired as people start to wake up to these realities, you need to treat everybody as an individual and say, rather than, oh, well, you're a millennial, so surely you want a beer keg and a foosball table, right?
Yeah.
Why don't you just ask them what they need? Hey,
no,
man,
Chris,
am I
Chris,
giving you...
Chris,
Huh?
everybody wants a beer keg and a foosball table. That's just
I don't
the
know.
truth,
I don't know if you guys can see my beer keg is back there in the background.
I
there.
can see it. Yes.
Hey, what's on tap, Cort?
It's actually, I think it's full of LaCroix right now.
Nice. Wait, they sell sparkling water by the keg? Yes.
That's next.
That's
but
awesome.
Guys, this is the thing. You've got to pay attention and start asking your people what they need. You need to develop programs. Don't just buy them off the shelf from some guy that looks good or gal that looks good in a suit, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I'm always really
said.
worried about people that have an agenda and also stand to lose if that agenda falls apart, right? And so this is an area where there's a ton of that. There's gurus that you can hire to come into your organization and fix all of your generation's problems, or maybe just give a 1-hour seminar about what members of different generations want. And I think that it's interesting. I mean, these ideas, we've seen these ideas, we've talked a little bit about these ideas. These individuals would stand to lose a lot if more people really understood what the actual science was behind this stuff. And I think we're starting to see a change. I mean, the National Academy's report should be influential, I would hope. Earlier, there was a report by the Center for Evidence-Based Management that reached basically the same conclusion. And so I have a few papers where we look at different literatures and come to similar conclusions. So I'm hoping that there's a bit of a mass of new kind of ideas behind this that sort of help to translate what the actual science is here. But I mean, to the extent that people like this stuff and to the extent that people are selling these ideas, I think people will still buy them. And so we got to focus a little bit. Like one area that I think is really interesting is let's focus on the gurus. Let's focus on what people do when they're trying to sell A, but the evidence for A doesn't exist. It's snake oil, right? To some extent. It's
right. Totally.
It's that's interesting. And then I want to know why people are buying it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, we all want to figure that one out for sure, for sure. Cort, this has just been a fantastic conversation talking about generations and generational differences and the lack thereof and debunking some of these myths. Today on the podcast, we talked about this whole idea of generations and some myths. We talked about some implications for people, leaders, and organizations. Anything else that you'd like to leave our listeners with there, Cort? Tell our listeners where they can find out more about you, those types of things.
Yeah, sure. So I have a website. It's pretty easy. It's cortrudolph.com. I post a lot of my papers there when I remember to update it. But I also have links on there to social media. I'm on Twitter at Cort Rudolph. I tweet a lot about generations and research in this space in kind of OBHR management and IO psychology.
Awesome. And I'm sure it's a challenge keeping your website updated because you publish a new paper about every other day. So, it's a lot of work. But I just wanted to say on behalf of Chris and myself, Cort, it has been an absolute pleasure having you as a guest on the Indigo Podcast.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.